Today, we're jumping into a really interesting theological blog post. It claims there's a modern crisis of marriage. And, it doesn't just stop at naming the problem. The author proposes a very specific, faith-based framework to actually solve it. So let's unpack that argument and see what it's all about.
All right, so here's our roadmap. First, we're going to look at what the source even means by a crisis. Then, and this is fascinating, we'll dig into some data about divorce rates that totally challenges what most of us think we know. After that, we get to the core of the solution, this idea called the order of love, which, believe it or not, is explained with a wild story about delinquent elephants. Seriously. We'll wrap it all up with the author's final call to action.
So right off the bat, the source frames this so-called marriage crisis as way more than just a bunch of personal problems. The argument is that when the family unit breaks down, it creates these ripple effects that, well, they end up touching all of us.
And this really is the question that drives the whole piece. What is the real cause of broken homes? The author suggests it isn't just about money or social pressures. No, they argue it's something deeper, what they call a fuzzy understanding and a fundamental misordering of love.
Now, to show you what's at stake, the source brings in this data. The point here is that family structure has a real measurable impact. According to the research they cite, kids from single-parent homes face a higher risk for things like poverty. And this is the bedrock for their whole argument, that a stable marriage is absolutely crucial for the next generation.
Okay, so this is where the main argument really starts to heat up. The author takes on a super common belief about divorce rates among Christians and basically says, hey, that statistic you always hear, it's totally misleading. You've probably heard this before, right? The idea on the left. Christians get divorced just as much as everybody else. But look at the author's claim on the right. They say, not so fast. It all depends on whether you distinguish between what they call active Christians and nominal Christians. And the theological basis for making that distinction, well, it comes from this specific verse in Matthew. The point they're making is that just saying you're a Christian isn't the same as actually living it out. And according to the author, that difference is the hidden key to understanding the real divorce stats.
So what do they even mean by a nominal Christian here? Well, in this argument, it's defined as someone who might identify as Christian but isn't really plugged into a church or living a committed life based on that faith. And you have to remember this definition because it's everything for the data that's coming up next.
And wow, check this out. This chart just visualizes the author's entire point. When you break down the data this way, not only do active Christians have a much lower divorce rate, get this, nominal Christians actually have a higher rate than non-Christians. I mean, that completely flips the common narrative on its head.
Okay, so if that's the problem, what's the solution? This is where the author presents their big idea. A very specific, hierarchical framework for love and priorities they call the biblical order of love.
And the framework itself is actually pretty simple. It's a three-step pyramid of priorities. God has to be first, your spouse comes second, and your children come third. The source argues that when you get this order mixed up, like, say, putting your kids before your spouse, the whole foundation of the marriage starts to crumble.
The reason for putting God first comes from this passage, which you might know as the Great Commandment. The thinking here is that God is the source of all love. So if you love God first, it actually makes you able to properly love everyone else, including your spouse and kids.
Then for the second priority, spouse over children, the source points to this verse from Ephesians. This whole idea of becoming one flesh is presented as this sacred bond that's second only to your relationship with God. So it bumps the marriage relationship above all other human relationships. Yep, even the one you have with your kids.
And then the article gets really specific about one role in particular. It says that the husband is the responsible party in this whole marriage covenant, that he's accountable to God for loving his wife and helping her grow spiritually. So according to this author, the primary weight of keeping the marriage healthy falls on the husband.
Now, to really hammer home the importance of specific roles, especially the father's role, the author uses this really memorable and kind of surprising analogy from the animal kingdom.
Which brings us to this question. Yeah, you heard that right, delinquent elephants. But stick with me here, because the author uses a true story about elephants to make a really powerful point about how crucial fathers are as a stabilizing force.
Okay, so here's the story. In this park in South Africa, rangers kept finding dead rhinos. But it wasn't poachers. The valuable horns were still there. They had no idea what was going on. Something was killing these huge animals for no reason. So they set up cameras to figure it out. And the answer was just shocking. It was teenage male elephants. Turns out, a group of young elephants had been moved to the park without any of the older adult bulls. So with no role models around, they were acting out, becoming hyper-aggressive and destructive. They were, essentially, delinquents.
So what did the park do? The solution was simple but genius. They brought in several massive adult bull elephants. And almost overnight, the presence of these older males completely changed the dynamic. The younger elephants settled down, and the killing stopped, just like that.
And there it is. That's the parallel the author is drawing. The whole story is used as a natural analogy to argue that fathers play this essential, stabilizing role in human families too, that they provide a kind of guidance and discipline that the source says is critical for healthy development.
All right, so let's bring this all together. The source wraps things up with a really direct call to action, basically telling readers to get to work and actively build their marriages using the principles we just talked about. And what kind of love does this framework require? Well, the author points to this famous passage from 1 Corinthians. The key phrase here is that this kind of love does not seek its own. It's self-sacrificial. And that's presented as the perfect antidote to the self-serving, out-of-order love that the author believes is causing the marriage crisis in the first place.
So when you boil it all down, the author's final plea is this. First, see marriage as a sacred covenant, not just some business contract. Second, ground that relationship in these biblical ideas. And finally, actively practice that self-giving love in the right order. God first, spouse second, and children third.
And so, we end where the source leaves us, with this big question to think about. After looking at the data, the framework, and, yes, the elephants, the author is ultimately asking if the solution to a huge, complex societal problem could be as simple and as difficult as just re-examining and reordering our deepest priorities.